Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of Anglo-Saxon England's most profound stories of faith, courage and sacrifice, the tale of Eorpwald, the Christian martyr king of East Anglia. We'll softly explore the remarkable yet tragically brief reign of this 7th century monarch, whose conversion to Christianity and subsequent martyrdom became a defining moment in England's spiritual transformation. From his father, Rædwald's mighty kingdom, to the religious upheavals that shaped early medieval England, we'll discover how one king's faith forever changed the course of history. This complete journey will take us through the misty landscapes of ancient East Anglia, the grand halls of Anglo-Saxon royalty, and the sacred spaces where Christianity first took root in English soil. We'll witness the clash between old gods and new faith, the political intrigue of royal courts, and the ultimate sacrifice of a king who chose his beliefs over his life. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. It truly helps us continue creating these soothing historical tales for our wonderful community. And if you haven't already, we'd love for you to subscribe and become part of our growing family of dreamers and history lovers. Don't be shy about leaving a gentle comment below sharing your thoughts about Eorpwald's story, or perhaps suggesting other historical figures you'd love to hear about in future episodes. Your voice matters to us, and we always enjoy hearing from our listeners. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. We're delighted to have you join us for this journey into the past. So cozy up under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the gentle whispers from 7th century England to carry you toward restful sleep. Tonight, we honor the memory of a king who died for his faith, and whose story echoes through the centuries as a testament to the power of conviction and the price of transformation. Eorpwald, later known as Saint Eorpwald the Martyr, lived in a world vastly different from our own, a realm of shifting kingdoms, ancient gods, and emerging Christianity that would reshape the very soul of England. To understand his remarkable yet tragic story, we must first journey back to the beginning of the 7th century, when Britain bore little resemblance to the unified nation we know today. Picture, if you will, a land wrapped in morning mist, where Roman roads stretched like forgotten memories across green hills and valleys. The great legions had departed 2 centuries earlier, leaving behind crumbling walls and empty fortresses that stood as silent witnesses to a vanished empire. In their place had come new peoples, Germanic tribes who crossed the North Sea. In their long boats, bringing with them different gods, different customs, and different dreams of what this green and pleasant land might become. In the early 7th century, when young Eorpwald drew his first breath around the year 590, Britain was a tapestry of competing kingdoms, each ruled by warrior kings who carved their domains from the ruins of Roman civilization. These were the Anglo-Saxons, those Germanic tribes including Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, who had been settling in Britain since the mid-5th century. By Eorpwald's time, they had established a collection of kingdoms that historians would later call the Heptarchy, though in reality, the political landscape was far more complex and fluid than this neat designation suggests. These kingdoms rose and fell like waves upon a shore, their fortunes tied to the strength and wisdom of their rulers, the loyalty of their warriors, and the favor of their gods. Northumbria dominated the north with its twin realms of Bernicia and Dara, vast territories that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Humber River. Mercia controlled the heart of England with ever-expanding ambitions, its kings dreaming of dominance over all the Anglo-Saxon peoples. Wessex held sway in the southwest, while Kent commanded the southeastern gateway to the continent, its ports welcoming traders and travelers from across the known world. Essex ruled over the lands of the East Saxons, Sussex governed the South Saxons, and in the east, where our story unfolds like a flower in the dawn light, lay the kingdom of the East Angles, East Anglia. This was a realm blessed by geography and enriched by trade, its fertile fields yielding abundant harvests, while its long coastline provided access to the merchant routes that connected Britain to Scandinavia, Frisia, and the kingdoms of continental Europe. Each kingdom maintained its own identity, customs, and often religion. The old Germanic gods still held sway over many hearts and minds in this ancient world. Woden the All-Father, the one-eyed god of war, wisdom, and poetry, watched over kings and warriors from his great hall of Valhalla. Thuna, whom we might know as Thor, wielded his mighty hammer against the forces of chaos and darkness. Tiw, the brave god of war and justice, inspired warriors to honorable combat and just judgment. Frigg, the mother goddess, protected families and blessed marriages with love and fertility. Sacred groves echoed with ancient chants on feast days and holy seasons, while burial mounds dotted the landscape like sleeping giants, containing the treasures and weapons of departed heroes. The sound of ceremonial horns would ring across the countryside during the great festivals, calling people to gather at holy sites, where priests offered sacrifices to the gods and bards sang the ancient stories that connected each tribe to their divine ancestors. Yet change was stirring in this ancient world, carried on Mediterranean winds and in the prayers of Christian missionaries who saw in these pagan lands a great harvest waiting to be gathered. The cross was beginning to appear alongside the hammer of Thuna and the spear of Woden, bringing with it not just new beliefs, but new ways of understanding kingship, justice, and the very purpose of human existence. The political structure of these kingdoms rested on personal loyalty and military prowess, bonds forged in the heat of battle and sealed with sacred oaths sworn before gods and men. Kings ruled through their war bands, groups of sworn warriors called Thens, who pledged their lives in exchange for treasure, land, and honor. These were not mere soldiers, but professional warriors who had chosen to bind their fates to their lords, sharing in his victories and prepared to die by his side in defeat. The King's Hall served as the center of power, a great wooden structure that was part palace, part fortress, and part sacred space. These magnificent buildings could stretch for hundreds of feet, their high peaked roofs supported by massive wooden pillars carved with intricate designs that told stories of gods and heroes. Rush torches and great fires in central hearths provided light and warmth, while the walls were hung with tapestries depicting the deeds of ancestors and the genealogies that connected each dynasty to the divine realm. Here, warriors feasted on roasted meat and drank mead from elaborately decorated horns, while poets sang of heroic deeds and the glory that awaited brave men in the halls of the gods. Plans for conquest or defense took shape around crackling fires, as kings consulted with their war bands and sought the wisdom of priests and seers who could interpret the will of the gods through sacrifices and divination. Trade connected these scattered kingdoms both to each other and to the wider world, bringing not only material goods, but also ideas, technologies, and influences that gradually transformed Anglo-Saxon society. Merchants sailed from Frisia bringing amber and glass, their ships following ancient routes across the North Sea that had connected these peoples for centuries. British traders carried wool, slaves, and silver across dangerous waters to the markets of the Rhine Delta and beyond. The port that would become Ipswich was already stirring to life during Eorpwald's youth, its wooden wharves welcoming ships from Scandinavia laden with furs and iron, or vessels from Francia carrying wine and fine metalwork. The sound of different languages mingled in the marketplaces, while exotic goods from lands as distant as Byzantium and even India found their way into the treasuries of Anglo-Saxon kings. Agriculture formed the backbone of society in this ancient world, much as it would for centuries to come. Most people lived in small villages scattered across the countryside, working strips of land that fed both themselves and their lords according to customs that reached back into the mists of time. The three-field system was beginning to emerge in some areas, allowing communities to feed growing populations more efficiently than the older two-field rotation. Barley and wheat waved in countless fields during the growing season, while cattle, sheep, and pigs provided meat, milk, and materials for daily life. The rhythm of agricultural life was marked by ancient festivals that celebrated the turning of the seasons and honored the gods who blessed the harvest. Ploughing began with ceremonies to ensure the favor of the Earth Mother, while harvest festivals thanked the gods for their bounty and prepared communities for the long winter months ahead. Yet beneath this seemingly stable agricultural rhythm lay constant tension and uncertainty. Kingdoms expanded and contracted based on the fortunes of war, and a year of poor harvest could leave even mighty rulers vulnerable to their enemies. A strong king might dominate his neighbors, extracting tribute and homage that filled his treasure chest and allowed him to reward his followers with gold and silver, fine weapons, and precious jewelry. But a weak ruler could see his realm carved apart by ambitious rivals, his warriors defeated and scattered, his treasure looted, and his people enslaved. The concept of the bretwalda, a high king who held sway over other monarchs, reflected this hierarchical reality, though such supremacy rarely lasted beyond a single generation and was always subject to challenge by rising powers. The religious landscape of this world was undergoing profound transformation during Eorpwald's lifetime, changes that would ultimately reshape not only spiritual beliefs, but also political relationships, social structures, and cultural practices. The old Germanic faiths that the Anglo-Saxons brought from their continental homelands were beginning to encounter Christianity, which had never entirely disappeared from Britain, despite the collapse of Roman rule. In remote western regions, British Christians had maintained their faith through the dark years following the Legion's departure, preserving in their monasteries and churches the traditions and learning that had flourished under Roman protection. These Celtic Christians had developed their own distinctive practices, slightly different from Roman tradition in matters such as the dating of Easter and the style of monastic tonsure, but fully committed to Christ and eager to share their faith with their pagan neighbors. Irish missionaries were beginning to cross the sea in increasing numbers, bringing with them a passionate and learned form of Christianity that would prove remarkably effective in converting the warrior cultures of northern Britain. These Celtic saints combined theological sophistication with practical wisdom, understanding that the conversion of pagan peoples required not just preaching, but also demonstration of Christianity's superior power and wisdom. At the same time, missionaries from Rome were working their way through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from the south, following the famous mission established by Augustine of Canterbury in 597 under the direction of Pope Gregory the Great. This Roman mission brought with it the prestige and authority of the Eternal City, along with connections to the broader Christian world that stretched from Ireland to Egypt and from Spain to Constantinople. The tension between old and new beliefs was not merely theological, it was deeply political and social, touching every aspect of Anglo-Saxon life. The pagan religions were intimately connected to kingship, warfare, and tribal identity. The king's authority derived partly from his claim to divine descent, usually traced back to Woden himself through genealogies that were jealously guarded and regularly recited at important ceremonies. To abandon the old gods was potentially to risk alienating one's warriors. weakening the bonds that held kingdoms together in an age when personal loyalty was the only reliable form of political organization. The warrior who had sworn his oath before the altars of Woden and Tuna might wonder whether such oaths remained binding if his lord converted to a foreign god who preached peace rather than war, forgiveness rather than vengeance. Yet Christianity offered compelling advantages that made conversion attractive to ambitious and thoughtful rulers. The new faith brought with it literacy and sophisticated administrative practices that could help kings govern more effectively and expand their power beyond traditional tribal boundaries. Christian kingdoms tended to form alliances with each other, creating networks of mutual support that could provide crucial assistance in times of crisis. More subtly, Christianity offered a different model of kingship that might actually strengthen royal authority in the long term. Christian rulers claimed divine appointment that did not depend solely on military success or ancestral honor, potentially providing more stable foundations for royal power. The universal character of the Christian God also offered theoretical justification for expanding royal authority beyond traditional tribal and kinship boundaries. The intellectual appeal of Christianity was also significant for rulers who were beginning to encounter the broader currents of European thought and culture. The new faith brought with it a rich tradition of learning that included not only theology, but also philosophy, history, law, and natural science. Christian scholars were the heirs of classical civilization, preserving and transmitting the wisdom of Greece and Rome, along with their own innovations and insights. This cultural sophistication was particularly attractive to Anglo-Saxon elites, who were becoming increasingly aware of their own isolation from the mainstream of European civilization. Christianity offered a path to participation in the broader intellectual and cultural life of the continent, while paganism seemed increasingly provincial and backward-looking. The landscape itself seemed to whisper of change during this crucial period. Ancient British hill forts stood empty on distant ridges, their ramparts overgrown with brambles and haunted by the memories of peoples who had vanished into legend. Roman villas crumbled in silent fields, their mosaic floors buried beneath centuries of neglect, while their walls slowly returned to the earth that had provided their stone and timber. Yet new settlements were rising throughout the countryside. Anglo-Saxon villages with their distinctive long houses, royal complexes like the one that would grow at Rendlesham, and ports that welcomed ships from across the known world. The old gods were still honored in sacred groves and at ancient stone circles, but new churches were beginning to appear alongside them, their wooden crosses standing as symbols of a different understanding of the divine. The very language was evolving during this period, as Old English absorbed words from Latin and Celtic tongues, while remaining distinctly Germanic in its heart and structure. Poets were beginning to adapt continental heroic traditions to British soil, creating a literature that would eventually produce masterpieces like Beowulf, with its haunting blend of pagan heroism and Christian wisdom. The oral culture that preserved genealogies, laws, and stories was slowly beginning to encounter the written word, though literacy remained largely confined to Christian clergy and a few members of the royal and noble classes. Books were rare and precious objects, often decorated with elaborate illuminations that combined Germanic artistic traditions with Christian symbolism in ways that reflected the cultural fusion taking place throughout Anglo-Saxon society. This was the complex and rapidly changing world that shaped young Eorpwald, a realm balanced between past and future, paganism and Christianity, isolation and connection to the wider world. It was a time when a single decision by a king could determine not only his own fate, but the spiritual destiny of his entire people, when the choice between old gods and new could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin, between life and death. In the halls of Rendlesham, where Eorpwald spent his youth learning the arts of kingship and war, these great currents of change swirled around the throne like mist around a sacred grove, waiting for the moment when they would burst forth and transform everything they touched. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic episodes in England's religious history, the brief, brilliant and tragic reign of a king who would choose faith over life, and in doing so, become one of the first English monarchs to die as a Christian martyr. His story would echo through the centuries as a testament to the price of spiritual transformation and the courage required to embrace a new understanding of the divine in an age when such choices could mean the difference between earthly glory and eternal salvation, between the approval of men and the favor of God, between the safety of compromise and the danger of absolute commitment to truth. The dynasty into which Eorpwald was born carried the proud name of Wuffinga, the descendants of the wolf, and their rise to power in East Anglia represented one of the most remarkable success stories of early Anglo-Saxon England, a tale of ambition, skill, and divine favor that would provide the foundation for one of the most influential royal houses of the age. The origins of this royal house stretch back into the mists of the 6th century, when Germanic warbands first crossed the North Sea in their long boats to carve kingdoms from the green fields of eastern Britain. These were dangerous times when survival depended on the sword and success belonged to those who could gather loyal warriors around them and lead them to victory against all who stood in their way. According to the genealogies preserved by later chroniclers, the Wuffingas traced their descent from Woden himself, the all-father of the Germanic gods, through a lineage that included Caesar, though this likely refers not to the Roman general, but to some forgotten Germanic king, whose name echoed the famous Latin title. These genealogies were not mere curiosities, but sacred documents that established the divine right of the dynasty to rule and connected each king to the cosmic forces that governed the world of men. The founder of the dynasty's historical prominence was Wehha, who established himself as the first recognizable king of the East Angles, sometime in the middle of the 6th century. Little is known of Wehha beyond his name, and the fact that he successfully established royal authority over the scattered tribes and settlements of what would become East Anglia. But his very existence marks the beginning of organized political power in one of Anglo-Saxon England's most important regions. The task that faced Wehha and his successors was enormous. The collapse of Roman rule had left a political vacuum that numerous competitors sought to fill, and the establishment of stable royal authority required not only military success, but also the ability to create new institutions and traditions that could bind together diverse peoples under a single crown. The early Wuffinga kings had to transform themselves from warband leaders into genuine monarchs, creating the administrative structures and ceremonial practices that would legitimize their rule and ensure its continuance. Wehha was succeeded by his son Wuffa, whose name would give the dynasty its identity for generations to come. Wuffa ruled during the latter half of the 6th century, a period when the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were still finding their feet and establishing their boundaries through countless wars and negotiations. The name Wuffa itself means wolf, suggesting either a personal characteristic or perhaps a totemic connection to this most revered of Germanic animals. The wolf was sacred to Woden, representing both the fierce loyalty of the warband and the predatory cunning necessary for survival in a hostile world. Wolves were admired for their intelligence, their cooperation in hunting, and their fearless protection of their pack, all qualities that Germanic warriors sought to emulate and that made the wolf an appropriate symbol for a royal dynasty seeking to establish its dominance over rival claimants. Under Wuffa's leadership, the Kingdom of the East Angles began to take definitive shape as a coherent political entity rather than merely a collection of allied tribes. The territory encompassed what we now know as Norfolk and Suffolk, with parts of Cambridgeshire and perhaps even extending into Essex during periods of expansion. This was rich agricultural land, blessed with fertile soil that could support substantial populations and generate the surplus wealth necessary to maintain large war bands and impressive royal courts. The kingdom's geography gave it several crucial advantages that would prove decisive in its rise to prominence. The long coastline provided access to the North Sea trading networks that connected Britain to Scandinavia, Frisia, and the Frankish kingdoms, bringing wealth and exotic goods that enhance royal prestige, while providing the resources necessary to reward loyal followers and attract new ones. Rivers like the Waveney, Yare, and Ouse offered convenient highways into the interior, allowing the royal administration to maintain control over distant territories while providing safe routes for traders and travelers. The extensive wetlands of the fens provided both protection from enemies and rich fishing grounds that supplemented the kingdom's agricultural resources, while the great forest that covered much of the region offered abundant timber for construction and shipbuilding. The region had been home to the Iceni tribe during the Roman period, the same people who had followed Queen Boudicca in her great rebellion against Roman rule more than 5 centuries earlier. The Wuffingas may have incorporated some British elements into their emerging kingdom, learning from local traditions and practices while gradually imposing their own Germanic customs and institutions. Archaeological evidence suggests that the early Wuffingas established their power centre in the Sandlings region of southeastern Suffolk, an area rich in ship burials and treasure hoards that speak to the dynasty's wealth and international connections. The magnificent ship burial at Sutton Hoo, which may have honoured one of Eorpwald's close relatives, demonstrates the extraordinary resources at the disposal of these early East Anglian kings and their participation in far-flung networks of trade and diplomacy. The treasures discovered at Sutton Hoo include objects that originated from as far away as Byzantium and India, suggesting that the Wuffinga court was connected to commercial and diplomatic networks that span the known world. Gold and silver work of extraordinary quality, weapons and armor of the finest materials, and artistic motifs that blend Germanic, Celtic, and even Mediterranean influences all speak to the sophistication and cosmopolitan character of early East Anglian civilization. Wuffa was followed by his son Titila, Eorpwald's grandfather, who ruled during the turbulent years around the turn of the 7th century. Titila's reign marked a crucial period in the dynasty's development, as he faced the challenge of maintaining East Anglian independence, while more powerful kingdoms like Kent and Northumbria were asserting their dominance over their neighbours and seeking to establish themselves as regional hegemons. The political landscape of Titila's time was dominated by Ethelbert of Kent, who had become the first Anglo-Saxon king to accept Christianity when he was baptized around 597 as part of the Great Gregorian Mission sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons. Ethelbert's conversion was not merely a personal spiritual decision, but a calculated political move that aligned Kent with the powerful Frankish kingdom across the English Channel and opened new possibilities for diplomatic and commercial relationships with Christian powers throughout Europe. This religious transformation carried enormous political implications, as Christian kingdoms formed natural alliances with each other, while pagan rulers found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The new faith brought with it not only spiritual benefits, but also practical advantages in the form of literacy, sophisticated administrative practices, and access to the broader currents of European culture and learning. Titila navigated these treacherous waters with considerable skill, maintaining East Anglia's independence while avoiding the fate of smaller kingdoms that were absorbed by their more powerful neighbours or reduced to client status under foreign overlords. The survival of the Wuffinga's dynasty during this period suggests that they were already demonstrating the political acumen and military capability that would make them one of Anglo-Saxon England's most successful royal houses. The strategies employed by Titular and his predecessors to build and maintain their power reveal sophisticated understanding of the complex forces shaping early medieval politics. They combined military strength with diplomatic flexibility, traditional Germanic customs with innovative administrative practices, and regional identity with broader international connections. The result was a kingdom that could compete successfully with much larger neighbours while maintaining its distinctive character and independence. When Titular died around 599, he was succeeded by his son Rædwald, Eorpwald's father, who would prove to be the most remarkable ruler in the dynasty's history and one of the most important figures in early Anglo-Saxon England. Rædwald inherited a stable kingdom with established borders, a functioning administration, and enough wealth to compete with the greatest powers of his day. But he also possessed the vision and ambition to transform East Anglia from a regional power into one of the most influential kingdoms in the Anglo-Saxon world. The Wuffingas had several advantages that helped explain their remarkable success during this crucial period. Their kingdom's location on the North Sea gave them access to continental trade networks and diplomatic connections that were becoming increasingly important as Anglo-Saxon England became more integrated into the broader European world. The rich agricultural lands of East Anglia could support a substantial population and generate the surplus wealth necessary to maintain large warbands, impressive royal courts, and the complex administrative apparatus required to govern an increasingly sophisticated kingdom. The region's geographic isolation, protected by forests, rivers, and marshlands, made it difficult for enemies to mount successful invasions, while allowing the East Anglians to choose when and where to commit their forces in support of allies or in pursuit of their own territorial ambitions. This strategic flexibility proved crucial in an age when kingdoms rose and fell based on their ability to form and maintain beneficial alliances, while avoiding entanglement in conflicts that could drain their resources or expose them to attack. Perhaps most importantly, the Wuffingas demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their independence and essential character. They embraced new technologies, adopted successful political practices from their neighbours, and showed a willingness to experiment with different religious and cultural traditions when it served their interests. This flexibility would prove crucial as Christianity began to spread throughout Anglo-Saxon England, presenting both opportunities and challenges for pagan dynasties seeking to maintain their power and influence. The dynasty's wealth and sophistication are evident in the archaeological record, which reveals a level of craftsmanship and international connections that rival anything found elsewhere in early medieval Europe. The ship burials at Sutton Hoo and Snape contain objects of extraordinary beauty and value, including jewelry, weapons, and ceremonial items that demonstrate the Wuffingas' participation in far-flung networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. These archaeological treasures also reveal the complex religious and cultural synthesis that characterized Wuffinga civilization during this period. Pagan and Christian symbols appear side by side. Germanic artistic traditions blend with Mediterranean influences, and objects from across the known world are combined in ways that speak to the cosmopolitan character of the East Anglian court and its openness to diverse cultural influences. The royal genealogies preserved by later chroniclers trace the Wuffingas' line through a series of semi-legendary figures back to Woden himself. following the standard pattern of Anglo-Saxon royal dynasties that sought to establish their divine credentials and cosmic significance. While these divine connections were certainly invented or elaborated by court poets and chroniclers seeking to enhance their patrons' prestige, they reflect the dynasty's own understanding of their place in the cosmic order and their responsibility to maintain the favor of the gods through just rule and generous patronage. To claim descent from Woden was to assert not only political legitimacy, but also a special relationship with the divine forces that governed warfare, poetry, wisdom, and royal authority. The king, who could trace his lineage back to the All-Father, possessed inherited wisdom and supernatural protection that ordinary mortals could never hope to match, while his subjects could take pride in serving a ruler whose blood carried the essence of divinity itself. By the time Eorpwald was born, probably around 590, the Wuffinga dynasty had established itself as one of the most successful and sophisticated royal houses in Anglo-Saxon England. They ruled over a prosperous kingdom, maintained extensive diplomatic and trading relationships, and possessed the military strength to defend their independence against all challengers, while projecting their influence far beyond their borders. The stage was set for Rædwald to transform this regional success into something far greater, a dominance over much of Anglo-Saxon England that would make East Anglia the most powerful kingdom south of the Humber, and establish the Wuffingas as the equals of any dynasty in the known world. The young prince, who would one day become a Christian martyr, was raised in the halls of one of Anglo-Saxon England's greatest royal houses, surrounded by the wealth, power, and traditions that made the descendants of the wolf the equal of any dynasty in Europe. Yet even as young Eorpwald learned the ancient stories of his ancestors and the traditional duties of kingship, the world around him was changing in ways that would challenge everything his dynasty had believed and achieved. New gods were stirring in the land, carried by missionaries who spoke of a different kind of divine authority, one that promised eternal salvation, but demanded the abandonment of ancient traditions and the transformation of fundamental beliefs about the nature of kingship, society, and human destiny. The collision between these old and new worlds would define Eorpwald's brief reign and ultimately cost him his life, making him both the last pagan king and the first Christian martyr of the House of Wuffa, a tragic figure whose sacrifice would help secure Christianity's ultimate triumph in the land his ancestors had ruled with such distinction for generations. No understanding of Eorpwald's tragic destiny would be complete without first exploring the yet extraordinary life and reign of his father, Rædwald, a king whose accomplishments would overshadow nearly every other ruler of his generation, and whose complex relationship with Christianity would profoundly influence his son's fate and the future of Anglo-Saxon England. Rædwald ascended to the throne of East Anglia around 599, inheriting from his father Titula a stable kingdom with established borders and functioning institutions, but one that remained decidedly regional in its influence and modest in its pretensions to greatness. When he died 25 years later, around 624, he had transformed East Anglia into the most powerful kingdom in Anglo-Saxon England and established himself as the dominant ruler south of the Humber River, a position of supremacy that would be remembered for generations and celebrated in the songs of poets throughout the Germanic world. His reign marked the high watermark of East Anglian power and influence, a golden age that his son would inherit, but tragically be unable to maintain. The transformation that Rædwald accomplished during his quarter century of rule was nothing short of remarkable, involving not only military conquest and political domination, but also cultural synthesis and religious innovation that would have lasting implications for the development of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The young Rædwald, who became king at the dawn of the 7th century, faced a complex political landscape dominated by Ethelbert of Kent, who had recently converted to Christianity and was actively using his new faith to forge alliances with other Christian rulers both in Britain and on the continent. The Gregorian mission, sent by Pope Gregory the Great in 597, had established itself in Canterbury and was beginning to spread its influence throughout southeastern England, bringing with it not only new religious beliefs, but also new models of kingship, administration, and cultural expression. For pagan rulers like Rædwald, this represented both a profound challenge and an unprecedented opportunity. The old certainties about divine favor and royal legitimacy were being questioned by the success of Christian kingdoms, but new possibilities for advancement and influence were also emerging for those who could navigate the changing religious landscape with skill and vision. The question was not whether change would come, but how to manage and direct that change in ways that would enhance rather than diminish royal power and kingdom prosperity. Rædwald's first major political move demonstrated the strategic thinking and diplomatic sophistication that would characterize his entire reign and mark him as one of the most astute rulers of his generation. Rather than resist the Christian tide or remain aloof from it in the manner of many pagan kings, he chose to engage directly with the new religion while carefully maintaining his independence and traditional authority. This approach required enormous courage and political skill, as it risked alienating both his pagan subjects and his Christian neighbors if not handled with perfect finesse. Sometime around 604, probably at the invitation of Ethelbert of Kent, Rædwald accepted baptism at the Kentish court, becoming one of the first major Anglo-Saxon kings to embrace Christianity and aligning himself publicly with the religious transformation that was sweeping through southeastern England. This was not a decision made lightly or in haste, but rather a calculated political move that reflected Rædwald's understanding of the changing dynamics of Anglo-Saxon politics and his determination to position East Anglia advantageously within the emerging new order. Yet Rædwald's conversion was far from complete or conventional by the standards that would later be established by more thoroughly Christianized kingdoms. When he returned to East Anglia after his baptism, he established what must rank as one of the most unusual religious arrangements in early medieval Europe: a temple containing two altars, one dedicated to Christ and the other to the traditional Germanic gods who had legitimized his dynasty's rule for generations. This remarkable compromise reflected Rædwald's pragmatic approach to the religious upheavals of his time and his understanding that successful kingship required balancing competing demands and interests rather than pursuing ideological purity at the expense of practical effectiveness. He was willing to embrace Christianity for its political and diplomatic advantages while refusing to abandon entirely the spiritual traditions that had brought his ancestors to power and continued to command the loyalty of his warriors and subjects. This religious syncretism drew criticism from Christian chroniclers like Bede, who saw it as apostasy and weakness, a failure to understand the exclusive claims of the Christian faith and the impossibility of serving both God and pagan idols. Yet from a political perspective, Rædwald's approach was masterful, demonstrating the kind of sophisticated statecraft that would make him one of the most successful rulers of his age. The dual altar arrangement allowed him to maintain the loyalty of his pagan warriors, who could continue to honor the gods of their fathers without feeling that their king had betrayed the traditions that legitimized their service. At the same time, it opened diplomatic channels with Christian kingdoms and provided access to the administrative innovations and cultural resources that Christianity brought in its wake. Most importantly, it demonstrated to his subjects and neighbors that he was a king who could adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning his essential identity as a Germanic war leader and protector of his people. The true test of Rædwald's greatness came in 616, when he was presented with one of the most crucial decisions of his reign, and perhaps the most important choice made by any Anglo-Saxon king during this period. Edwin, the rightful heir to the throne of Deira and one of the most important kingdoms in Northumbria, had sought refuge at Rædwald's court after being driven into exile by Æthelfrith of Northumbria, who had usurped the Deiran throne and was determined to eliminate any potential rivals to his authority. Æthelfrith, recognizing the enormous threat that Edwin represented to his own rule and the stability of his kingdom, sent increasingly generous offers to Rædwald, first requesting Edwin's death, then demanding it, and finally threatening war if his demands were not met. The Northumbrian king understood that as long as Edwin lived, his own position would remain precarious, and he was prepared to go to any lengths to eliminate this challenge to his authority. The situation presented Rædwald with an almost impossible choice that would test every aspect of his character and political wisdom. To hand over Edwin would violate the sacred duty of hospitality that bound Germanic kings to protect those who sought sanctuary at their courts, a tradition so fundamental to Anglo-Saxon culture that its violation would permanently damage his reputation and authority. No king worthy of the name would betray a guest for gold or yield to threats from a neighbor, regardless of the practical advantages such betrayal might bring. Yet to refuse Æthelfrith's demands would mean war with Northumbria, the most powerful kingdom in northern England and one of the strongest military forces in all of Britain. The Northumbrian army was larger and more experienced than any force that Rædwald could field, and defeat in such a conflict would likely mean not only his own death, but the destruction of his kingdom and the enslavement of his people. A lesser king might have compromised, perhaps arranging for Edwin's accidental death, or quietly encouraging him to seek refuge elsewhere, thus avoiding direct confrontation while maintaining plausible deniability. Instead, Rædwald chose the path that would define his legacy and establish him as one of the great heroes of Anglo-Saxon legend. According to the chroniclers, his queen played a crucial role in this decision, reminding him that no king worthy of the name would betray a guest for gold or yield to threats from a neighbor. Whether this intervention actually occurred or was a literary device created by later writers to emphasize the moral dimensions of the choice, it captured an essential truth about Rædwald's character. He was a king who understood that some principles could not be compromised without destroying the very foundations of royal authority and personal honor. The decision to protect Edwin demonstrated that Rædwald possessed not only political intelligence, but also moral courage, the willingness to risk everything for principles that transcended immediate political advantage. This combination of practical wisdom and ethical commitment would prove to be one of the defining characteristics of truly great rulers throughout history, marking Rædwald as a king whose influence extended far beyond mere military success or diplomatic cleverness. Rædwald's decision to protect Edwin led directly to the Battle of the River Idle in 616, one of the most consequential military engagements in early Anglo-Saxon history, and a confrontation that would reshape the political landscape of northern England for generations to come. Rædwald assembled a formidable army from throughout East Anglia and marched north to confront Æthelfrith, taking Edwin with him and transforming the Deiran exile from a refugee into a claimant to the Northumbrian throne with a powerful army at his back. The battle itself was fierce and costly, reflecting the high stakes involved and the determination of both sides to achieve decisive victory. The fighting raged along the banks of the River Idle, with warriors falling on both sides as kings and princes led their men in personal combat, according to the heroic traditions of their ancestors. Both Æthelfrith and Rædwald's own son Reginhir were killed in the fighting, making the victory bittersweet for the East Anglian king, who had gained a kingdom for his protege, but lost his eldest son and heir in the process. Yet the East Anglian victory was decisive and far-reaching in its consequences. Ethelfrith's death eliminated one of the most powerful and dangerous rulers in northern England, while Edwin's installation as King of Northumbria gave Rædwald enormous influence over the most powerful kingdom in the north. More significantly, the victory established Rædwald as the dominant power south of the Humber, a position that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later recognize by listing him among the bretwaldas, the high kings who exercised authority over other Anglo-Saxon rulers. The consequences of this triumph extended far beyond the immediate military outcome and would influence the development of Anglo-Saxon England for decades to come. Edwin was installed as King of Northumbria with Rædwald's support, creating a relationship of obligation and alliance that gave the East Anglian king unprecedented influence over northern affairs. The victory also demonstrated that effective leadership and strategic thinking could overcome numerical disadvantages, inspiring other smaller kingdoms to resist domination by their larger neighbours. Rædwald's newfound supremacy manifested itself in numerous ways that reflected both the extent of his power and the sophistication of his approach to ruling a diverse coalition of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Tribute flowed into East Anglia from subordinate kingdoms, swelling the royal treasury and allowing Rædwald to maintain a magnificent court that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. The archaeological evidence from Sutton Hoo suggests that the East Anglian royal court during this period possessed wealth and artistic sophistication that matched or exceeded the greatest centres of power in Francia or Italy. The treasures discovered in the Great Ship Burial include objects that originated from across the known world: Byzantine silver, Indian garnets, Swedish metalwork, and Frankish coins, demonstrating the international character of Rædwald's court and the extensive networks of trade and diplomacy that his power made possible. These were not merely valuable objects, but symbols of royal authority and cosmic connections that enhanced the king's prestige, while providing tangible evidence of his success to subjects and visitors alike. The king's influence extended far beyond military dominance and material wealth to encompass cultural and religious leadership that would have lasting impact on the development of Anglo-Saxon civilization. As one of the few Christian rulers in England following the temporary pagan resurgence in Kent and Essex after 616, Rædwald found himself in the unique position of being the sole protector of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England for several crucial years, a role that carried enormous responsibility and potential influence. The Gregorian mission that had been established in Canterbury might well have collapsed entirely during this period had it not been for Rædwald's protection and support. The missionaries who had come from Rome to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons found their position precarious when their royal patrons in Kent and Essex died or apostatized, leaving them without the political backing necessary to continue their work effectively. Rædwald's willingness to shelter and support them during this difficult period may have saved the entire Roman mission from destruction and ensured the survival of Christianity in southeastern England. This role as defender of the faith paradoxically coexisted with Rædwald's continued commitment to traditional Germanic religious practices, creating a complex religious situation that reflected the broader tensions and transformations occurring throughout Anglo-Saxon society. The dual altar arrangement in his temple seems to have persisted throughout his reign, suggesting that he never fully resolved the tension between his Christian identity and his pagan heritage, preferring instead to maintain a careful balance that preserved his options while avoiding irrevocable commitments. This religious ambiguity would have profound consequences for his son's later struggles with conversion and martyrdom. As Eorpwald would inherit not only his father's throne, but also the unresolved tensions between Christianity and paganism that Rædwald had managed to balance through sheer force of personality and political skill. The example of religious compromise that had served the father so well would prove far more difficult for the son to maintain in the changed circumstances of the following generation. Rædwald's domestic achievements during his reign were equally impressive and far-reaching, involving not only the maintenance of internal stability, but also the promotion of economic development and cultural innovation that enhanced the kingdom's prosperity and influence. Under his rule, East Anglia experienced unprecedented prosperity and cultural flowering that would be remembered as a golden age for generations to come. The port of Gippswick, the ancestor of modern Ipswich, was established during this period as a major centre for North Sea trade, connecting East Anglia to the broader commercial networks that linked Britain to Scandinavia, Frisia, and the continent. The town's rapid growth reflected both the kingdom's expanding prosperity and its integration into the wider European economy. As merchants from across the known world came to trade in the markets that flourished under royal protection and encouragement, archaeological evidence suggests that craftsmen working for the royal court during Rædwald's reign produced metalwork, jewelry, and weapons of extraordinary quality that demonstrated both technical mastery and artistic sophistication. The objects discovered at Sutton Hoo represent the pinnacle of early medieval craftsmanship, combining traditional Germanic artistic motifs with influences from across Europe and beyond, in ways that created genuinely original and beautiful works of art. The kingdom's agricultural output also increased substantially during this period, as new farming techniques and improved organization allowed communities to support larger populations while generating greater surpluses for trade and taxation. The prosperity that resulted from these improvements provided the economic foundation for Rædwald's military and diplomatic successes, while also enhancing the quality of life for ordinary people throughout the kingdom. The king also proved to be an astute diplomat, maintaining complex relationships with kingdoms throughout Anglo-Saxon England and beyond, that reflected his understanding of the interconnected nature of early medieval politics. His marriage alliance with the royal house of Essex strengthened East Anglia's southern border, while providing opportunities for cooperative ventures and mutual support. His protection of Edwin created lasting ties with Northumbria that would influence northern politics for decades. Even his religious compromises served diplomatic purposes, allowing him to work effectively with both Christian and pagan rulers as circumstances required. This flexibility proved invaluable in an age when religious differences were becoming increasingly important factors in political relationships, as Rædwald could present himself as either a Christian ally or a respecter of traditional customs depending on the audience and the situation. The international dimensions of Rædwald's diplomacy reflected his understanding that East Anglia's future prosperity and security depended partly on its relationships with continental powers, particularly the Frankish kingdoms that were becoming increasingly important players in northwestern European politics. His court welcomed visitors from across the known world, creating an atmosphere of cosmopolitan sophistication that enhanced royal prestige while providing access to new ideas and technologies. Yet beneath this remarkable success lay tensions and contradictions that would eventually contribute to his son's downfall and the temporary collapse of East Anglian power. Rædwald's religious syncretism, while politically clever, created uncertainty about the spiritual direction of the kingdom that would prove difficult for his successors to manage. His pagan warriors remained committed to the old gods and suspicious of Christian influences, while a growing Christian faction looked to the new faith for guidance and legitimacy. The king's own example suggested that these traditions could coexist indefinitely, but this compromise would prove far more difficult for his successors to maintain when faced with the more polarized religious environment that was emerging throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The careful balance that Rædwald had maintained through personal authority and diplomatic skill would require different approaches and perhaps different compromises under changed circumstances. The manner of Rædwald's death around 624 remains one of the great mysteries of Anglo-Saxon history, though its timing coincided with significant changes in the political and religious landscape that may have influenced the circumstances of his passing. The magnificent ship burial at Sutton Hoo, with its extraordinary blend of pagan and Christian symbolism, may represent his final resting place, though this remains a matter of scholarly debate that reflects the broader uncertainties surrounding this crucial period. Whether the burial was pagan or Christian in intent, it certainly reflected the religious ambiguity that characterized Rædwald's entire reign and the complex cultural synthesis that he had fostered throughout his kingdom. The treasures buried with the ship, gold and silver jewelry, weapons and armor, ceremonial objects and personal possessions, speak to both the wealth of his court and the international connections that had made East Anglia a major power in the Anglo-Saxon world. What is clear is that Rædwald's death marked the end of East Anglia's brief period of dominance over Anglo-Saxon England, and the beginning of a new phase in the kingdom's history that would test whether the institutions and traditions he had established could survive under different leadership. His son Eorpwald inherited a kingdom at the height of its power and influence, but he also inherited the unresolved tensions between Christianity and paganism that his father had managed to balance through sheer force of personality and political skill. The stage was set for a drama that would test whether the delicate compromises of Rædwald's reign could survive under a different kind of king, one who would prove far more committed to Christianity than his father had ever been, and whose wholehearted embrace of the new faith would ultimately lead to his martyrdom and the temporary triumph of pagan forces throughout East Anglia. Rædwald's legacy as the father of a martyr is thus deeply complex and multifaceted, involving not only his remarkable achievements as a king and conqueror, but also his role in creating the conditions that would make his son's conversion and sacrifice both possible and necessary. His own religious journey had been one of careful balance and strategic compromise, allowing him to embrace Christianity without fully abandoning the traditions that legitimized his rule and maintain the loyalty of his followers. His son would take a very different path, one marked by a wholehearted commitment to the Christian faith and ultimate sacrifice for those beliefs. In many ways, Eorpwald's martyrdom represented the completion of a spiritual journey that his father had begun but never finished, the full transformation from pagan war king to Christian monarch, even unto death. The great king who had made East Anglia a power to rival any kingdom in Europe had given his son many gifts: wealth, influence, a magnificent kingdom, and a proud heritage that connected him to the greatest traditions of Germanic kingship. But perhaps the most important legacy was the example of how a king might navigate the treacherous waters of religious change while maintaining his essential dignity and authority, even if that navigation ultimately required different choices and different sacrifices than those his father had made. That Eorpwald would choose a different course, one that led to martyrdom rather than compromise, does not diminish the remarkable achievements of his father, whose reign represented one of the high points of Anglo-Saxon kingship, and whose complex relationship with Christianity helped set the stage for England's eventual conversion to the faith. The story of both father and son speaks to the profound challenges faced by rulers during this period of religious transformation, and to the different ways that principled men might respond to the demands of conscience and the responsibilities of kingship in an age when such choices could determine the fate of kingdoms and the salvation of souls. To understand the forces that would ultimately claim Eorpwald's life, one must appreciate the magnitude of the religious transformation sweeping through Anglo-Saxon England during the early 7th century, a revolution that challenged not merely individual beliefs, but the very foundations of Germanic society, kingship, and cultural identity in ways that would reshape the entire fabric of English civilization. The arrival of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England was not a single event, but rather a complex process that unfolded over several generations and involved multiple waves of missionary activity from different sources, each bringing its own distinctive approach to the challenge of converting pagan peoples and establishing the new faith in hostile or indifferent environments. This religious transformation would prove to be one of the most significant developments in English history, affecting every aspect of society from royal courts to peasant villages, from military practices to artistic expression, from legal traditions to family relationships. The most famous of these missionary efforts was the Gregorian mission, launched by Pope Gregory the Great in 597, when he sent Augustine and 40 monks to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons and establish the Roman Church in Britain. This mission represented the culmination of Gregory's vision of a unified Christian Europe stretching from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, with Britain playing a crucial role in the evangelization of the Germanic peoples who had settled throughout the former Roman territories. Yet this Roman mission was not the only source of Christian influence, nor was its success as immediate or complete as later chroniclers sometimes suggested. The religious transformation of Anglo-Saxon England involved multiple sources of Christian influence, complex interactions between different traditions of Christian practice, and a gradual process of adaptation and synthesis that would continue for generations after the initial conversions. Christianity had never entirely disappeared from Britain, following the collapse of Roman rule in the early 5th century. In the western regions of the island, particularly in Wales, Cornwall, and the Scottish Highlands, British Christians had maintained their faith through the tumultuous centuries of Anglo-Saxon conquest, preserving in their monasteries and churches the traditions and learning that had flourished under Roman protection, while developing their own distinctive practices and institutions. These Celtic Christians had not remained isolated from the broader Christian world, but had maintained contacts with Ireland, Gaul, and even more distant Christian lands through networks of trade, pilgrimage, and scholarly exchange. Their monasteries served as centers of learning and artistic production, preserving classical texts while creating new works of theology, history, and literature that would influence Christian development throughout northwestern Europe. The Irish had embraced Christianity with particular enthusiasm during the 5th and 6th centuries, transforming their island into what would later be called the land of saints and scholars, and developing a distinctive form of monasticism that emphasized scholarship, missionary activity, and ascetic practices. Irish missionaries, driven by passionate devotion and remarkable courage, began crossing the sea in increasing numbers to carry their faith to the pagan peoples of Scotland and northern England, establishing monasteries and churches that would become centers of Christian learning and evangelization. These Celtic missions would prove to be just as important as the Roman effort in the ultimate conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, bringing a different approach to Christian practice and different solutions to the challenges of establishing the new faith in pagan societies. The Irish missionaries combined theological sophistication with practical wisdom, understanding that the conversion of warrior cultures required not just preaching, but also demonstration of Christianity's superior power and wisdom through miraculous signs and effective leadership. The religious landscape that these various Christian missions encountered was far from uniform or simple. involving not just resistance to the new faith, but also complex interactions between different pagan traditions, local variations in belief and practice, and evolving responses to changing political and social circumstances. The Anglo-Saxon peoples had brought with them from their continental homelands a sophisticated array of Germanic religious beliefs and practices that had developed over centuries of cultural evolution and adaptation to different environments and circumstances. Woden, the All-Father and God of war, poetry, and wisdom, stood at the head of a pantheon that included numerous divine figures who governed different aspects of human existence and natural phenomena. Thunor, whom we might know as Thor, wielded his mighty hammer against the forces of chaos and darkness, protecting mankind from giants and monsters while ensuring the fertility of the earth and the success of the harvest. Tiw, the brave god of war and justice, inspired warriors to honorable combat and just judgment, while also presiding over legal assemblies and oath-making ceremonies. Frigg, the mother goddess, protected families and blessed marriages with love and fertility, while also serving as the patron of domestic crafts and household management. Numerous other deities governed specific aspects of life. Balder, the beautiful god of light and purity. Loki, the trickster whose cunning sometimes helped and sometimes hindered the gods. And many local spirits and supernatural beings who inhabited particular places or influenced specific activities. These gods were not distant, abstract deities, but active participants in the world of men, intimately involved in human affairs and deeply concerned with the behavior and welfare of their worshippers. They demanded sacrifice and ritual observance, rewarded valor and generosity, and punished cowardice, oath-breaking, and violations of sacred customs. The relationship between gods and mortals was understood as a form of reciprocity, with humans offering worship and sacrifice in exchange for divine protection and blessing. The connection between the gods and Germanic kingship was particularly intimate and complex, involving not just personal devotion, but also political legitimacy and cosmic authority. Most royal dynasties claim descent from Woden himself, tracing their genealogies back through legendary kings and heroes to the All-Father's divine realm. This connection was not merely ceremonial, but practical, as the Aichu, king's success in battle and ability to reward his followers, were seen as direct evidence of divine favor and supernatural power. Germanic religion was also deeply tied to concepts of honor, loyalty, and kinship that formed the basis of Anglo-Saxon society and provided the moral framework within which individuals and communities organized their lives. The warrior's duty to his lord, the lord's obligation to protect and reward his followers, and the king's responsibility to lead his people to victory and prosperity were all understood in religious as well as social terms, creating a complex web of sacred obligations that governed behavior and defined identity. To abandon the old gods was potentially to undermine the entire structure of Germanic society, calling into question not only religious beliefs, but also social relationships, political institutions, and cultural practices that had developed over centuries of tradition and experience. The warrior who had sworn his oath before the altars of Woden and Thunor might wonder whether such oaths remained binding if his lord converted to a foreign god who preached peace rather than war, forgiveness rather than vengeance. Yet Christianity offered compelling alternatives to these traditional beliefs and practices, presenting a vision of divine authority and human destiny that could address many of the concerns and aspirations that drove Germanic religious life, while providing solutions to problems that the old gods seemed unable to solve. The Christian god was presented as more powerful than any Germanic deity, capable of granting victory in battle and prosperity in peace to those who served him faithfully. while also offering the promise of eternal salvation that transcended the limitations of earthly life and honor. The promise of eternal salvation provided an answer to the Germanic warrior's greatest fear, that death might come before he had achieved sufficient honor to secure remembrance among his people and a place in the halls of the gods. Christianity offered the possibility of eternal life in the presence of God, a reward that surpassed any earthly honor and could not be lost through subsequent failure or misfortune. This promise proved particularly appealing to warriors who faced constant danger and uncertainty, as well as to rulers who sought to ensure their dynasty's long-term survival and success. Christian concepts of divine justice and mercy also offered hope to those who suffered under the often harsh realities of early medieval life, promising that earthly injustices would be corrected in the afterlife, and that God's love extended to all people regardless of their social status or material circumstances. This message proved attractive not only to slaves and peasants, but also to nobles and kings who recognized that worldly power and wealth could not guarantee happiness or security in an uncertain world. Perhaps most importantly for kings and nobles, Christianity brought with it access to literacy, sophisticated administrative practices, and diplomatic connections to the powerful Christian kingdoms of continental Europe that were becoming increasingly important players in the broader European political system. The Roman and Byzantine empires, the Frankish kingdom, and other Christian powers were eager to establish relationships with newly converted rulers, offering both spiritual guidance and practical support in the form of trade agreements, military alliances, and cultural exchange. The institutional structure of the Christian Church also provided new models of organization and authority that could enhance royal power while providing more effective means of governing increasingly complex societies. Christian bishops and priests were typically literate and educated, capable of serving as administrators, diplomats, and advisors in ways that traditional Germanic wise men and priests often could not match. The Church's hierarchical structure and centralized authority offered examples of institutional organization that could be adapted to secular purposes, while Christian law and theology provided sophisticated frameworks for understanding justice, authority, and social relationships. The process of conversion was rarely smooth or straightforward, involving complex negotiations between missionaries and potential converts, careful adaptation of Christian teachings to local customs and concerns, and gradual transformation of existing institutions rather than their sudden replacement. Even when a king accepted baptism, as Rædwald had done, the transformation of an entire kingdom from paganism to Christianity could take generations and often involve setbacks, reversals, and compromises that reflected the deep cultural roots of traditional beliefs and practices. Christian missionaries had learned from both successes and failures that the process of royal conversion was as much about statecraft as it was about theology, requiring careful attention to political considerations and cultural sensitivities. The new faith had to be presented in ways that enhanced rather than diminished royal authority, while traditional sources of legitimacy had to be gradually replaced rather than suddenly abandoned. This process required not only theological knowledge, but also practical wisdom about human nature, political dynamics, and cultural change. The conversion of Edwin of Northumbria in 627 represented a crucial turning point in this religious revolution, bringing the most powerful kingdom in northern England into the Christian fold, and creating a domino effect that would influence the religious choices of other Anglo-Saxon rulers for generations to come. Edwin's acceptance of Christianity, influenced partly by his marriage to a Christian princess from Kent, and partly by his own spiritual journey under the guidance of the missionary Paulinus, demonstrated that even the most powerful and successful pagan rulers could find compelling reasons to embrace the new faith. More importantly, Edwin actively promoted Christianity throughout his territories, establishing churches, supporting missionaries, and using his political influence to encourage conversion among his allies and subordinates. This aggressive promotion of the new faith created a network of Christian kingdoms stretching from Kent to the Scottish borders, fundamentally altering the religious and political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England and creating new pressures for remaining pagan rulers to conform to the emerging Christian consensus. It was Edwin's influence that would prove decisive in Eorpwald's own conversion, creating a situation where the young East Anglian king found himself increasingly isolated as one of the few remaining pagan rulers in southeastern England. The relationship between the two kings was complex, involving both personal obligations stemming from Edwin's debt to Eorpwald's father, and political realities reflecting Edwin's growing dominance over northern English affairs. The appeal of Christianity to individual Anglo-Saxon kings went beyond mere political calculation to include genuine spiritual and intellectual attractions that addressed fundamental questions about the nature of divine authority, human destiny, and royal responsibility. The new faith offered a different model of kingship, one based on divine appointment rather than purely hereditary or military claims, which could potentially strengthen royal power by providing alternative sources of legitimacy to traditional Germanic emphasis on military success and ancestral honor. Christian kings were presented as God's representatives on earth, ruling not merely through force of arms, but through divine authority that transcended human limitations and worldly circumstances. This concept could potentially strengthen royal power by providing more stable foundations for political authority, while also offering justification for expanding royal influence beyond traditional tribal and kinship boundaries that had limited the scope of Germanic kingship. The theological framework of Christianity also provided sophisticated answers to questions about justice, authority, and social organization that were becoming increasingly important as Anglo-Saxon societies became more complex and interconnected. Christian teachings about natural law, divine justice, and moral obligation offered intellectual resources for addressing legal and political problems that traditional Germanic customs and practices were not always equipped to handle effectively. Yet the same features that made Christianity attractive to some also made it threatening to others, creating the conditions for conflict and resistance that would ultimately claim Eorpwald's life. The new faith's emphasis on universal brotherhood and divine love potentially undermined the intense loyalty to kinship groups and warrior bands that formed the basis of Germanic society. While its teachings about humility and forgiveness could be seen as weakness in a culture that prized martial valor and the aggressive pursuit of honor, most dangerously, Christianity's exclusive claims that Christ was the only true God and that salvation came only through him directly challenged the legitimacy of the traditional gods who had sanctified Germanic kingship for centuries and provided the spiritual foundations for existing social and political relationships. The assertion that Woden, Thuna, and the other Germanic deities were either false gods or demons in disguise struck at the heart of everything that Anglo-Saxon culture held sacred, threatening to delegitimize not only religious practices, but also the entire structure of society that depended on those practices for its coherence and authority. The missionary methods employed by Christian evangelists varied considerably depending on their background, training, and the circumstances they encountered, but all faced similar challenges in adapting their message to the concerns and interests of Germanic warrior cultures while maintaining the essential character of Christian teaching. Roman missionaries like Augustine tended to work through royal courts, seeking to convert kings in the hope that their subjects would follow their example and accept the new faith as a matter of political loyalty and social conformity. This top-down approach could achieve rapid results when successful, transforming entire kingdoms from paganism to Christianity within a single generation. But it also meant that the depth of conversion among ordinary people might remain questionable for generations. The superficial character of many early conversions would become apparent during periods of political crisis or religious reaction, when popular support for Christianity proved insufficient to sustain the new faith without continued royal patronage and protection. Celtic missionaries often took a different approach, establishing monasteries that served as centers of learning and spiritual guidance, while gradually winning converts through their example of holy living and their willingness to adapt Christian teachings to local customs and concerns. This method typically produced slower but more thorough conversions, as communities had time to absorb and internalize the new faith through sustained contact with committed Christians who demonstrated the practical benefits of Christian life. Both approaches face similar challenges when dealing with the deep cultural associations between religion and political authority in Germanic society. The pagan priests and wise men who served Anglo-Saxon courts were not merely religious figures, but also political advisors, whose influence extended far beyond spiritual matters to encompass law, diplomacy, military strategy, and royal ceremonial. Converting a kingdom to Christianity meant displacing these traditional sources of wisdom and authority, a process that inevitably created resistance and resentment among those whose positions were threatened by religious change. The Christian Revolution in Anglo-Saxon England was thus far more than a simple matter of religious belief or personal spirituality. It represented a fundamental transformation of society, politics, and culture that challenged every aspect of traditional Germanic life and required the development of new institutions, new relationships, and new understandings of authority, identity, and purpose. Kings who embraced Christianity were not merely changing their personal faith, but committing themselves and their kingdoms to a new understanding of divine authority, social organization, and cultural identity that would have far-reaching consequences for generations to come. By the time Eorpwald inherited the throne of East Anglia around 624, this great transformation was well underway, but far from complete, creating a complex and dangerous situation for rulers who had to navigate between competing religious and political loyalties while trying to maintain their kingdom's independence and prosperity. The success of Christian missions in Kent and Northumbria had demonstrated the appeal and practical benefits of the new faith, while the temporary pagan resurgences in those same kingdoms had shown how fragile early conversions could be when they lacked deep popular support or faced determined opposition. The stage was set for East Anglia to become the next battleground in the struggle between old and new, pagan and Christian, tradition and innovation, a struggle that would ultimately cost the young king his life, but help secure Christianity's ultimate triumph in Anglo-Saxon England. The religious revolution that had begun with Augustine's mission in 597 would reach its climax in the martyrdom of a king who would discover that in the rapidly changing world of 7th century Britain, the old compromises were no longer sufficient, and that commitment to the Christian faith might require the ultimate sacrifice of life itself. Prince Eorpwald entered the world around 590, born into privilege and power as the son of one of Anglo-Saxon England's most successful kings, yet destined for a fate that would transform him from royal heir to Christian martyr in the space of just a few tumultuous years that would test his character, challenge his beliefs, and ultimately define his legacy for generations to come. His childhood unfolded in the magnificent royal complex at Rendlesham, the heart of Wuffinga power in East Anglia, and one of the most sophisticated centers of government and culture in early medieval Europe. This was no crude timber hall rising from muddy fields. but a carefully planned and beautifully executed complex of buildings that reflected both the wealth of the kingdom and the international connections of its rulers, demonstrating the level of sophistication that Anglo-Saxon civilization had achieved by the beginning of the 7th century. Archaeological evidence suggests that the royal residence combined impressive wooden buildings with extensive gardens, workshops, and ceremonial spaces that served multiple functions within the complex machinery of early medieval government. The Great Hall itself would have been a magnificent structure, perhaps 300 feet in length, with a soaring roof supported by massive carved pillars and walls decorated with tapestries and metalwork that told the stories of the dynasty's divine ancestors and heroic achievements. Surrounding this central structure were numerous smaller buildings that housed the various functions of royal government, treasuries where the kingdom's wealth was stored and displayed, workshops where skilled craftsmen created the weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that expressed royal power and divine favor, guest halls where visiting dignitaries could be entertained with appropriate magnificence, and private chambers where the royal family could retreat from the public demands of kingship. Young Eorpwald would have been surrounded by luxury and splendor from his earliest days, growing up in an environment where every object carried messages about power, legitimacy, and cultural sophistication. The treasures later discovered at Sutton Hoo provide a glimpse of the magnificent objects that adorned the East Anglian court during this period. Golden jewelry of exquisite craftsmanship that demonstrated the skill of royal goldsmiths, weapons decorated with intricate patterns and precious stones that spoke to the martial traditions of the dynasty, and ceremonial items that reflected connections stretching from Scandinavia to Byzantium. This was a world where art and politics intertwined in complex ways, where the beauty of an object could enhance its owner's prestige while also serving practical functions within the elaborate ceremonies that maintained royal authority and divine legitimacy. Every cup from which the prince drank, every garment he wore, every toy with which he played would have been crafted to the highest standards and decorated with symbols that connected him to his illustrious ancestors and divine protectors. The prince's education would have followed the traditional patterns of Germanic royal training, but with the cosmopolitan additions that reflected his father's broad interests and international connections. He learned the ancient stories of his people, the genealogies that traced the Wuffinga line back to Woden himself, the heroic tales of continental ancestors who had carved kingdoms from the wilderness, and the complex laws and customs that governed East Anglian society and defined the rights and obligations of kings and subjects. Yet he also encountered new ideas and influences that were beginning to transform the Anglo-Saxon world in fundamental ways. The royal court at Rendlesham attracted visitors from across the known world, creating an atmosphere of cosmopolitan sophistication that exposed the young prince to diverse perspectives and alternative ways of understanding the world and its possibilities. Frisian merchants brought amber, glass, and news from the continental trading centres, their ships following ancient routes across the North Sea that connected East Anglia to the broader commercial networks of early medieval Europe. These traders carried not only material goods, but also stories, ideas, and cultural influences that gradually permeated the atmosphere of the royal court and shaped the intellectual development of those who lived there. Frankish diplomats carried messages between the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe, bringing with them not only immediate political intelligence, but also broader knowledge of the religious and cultural transformations that were reshaping continental civilization. Their presence at the East Anglian court exposed Eorpwald to alternative models of kingship and statecraft that would prove influential in his later development as a ruler and as a Christian convert. Celtic scholars and craftsmen shared their knowledge and skills, contributing to the remarkable cultural synthesis that characterized the court of Rædwald, and would influence the artistic and intellectual development of East Anglian civilization for generations. These learned men brought with them not only practical expertise, but also different approaches to learning and spirituality that would broaden the young prince's understanding of human possibility and divine truth. Most intriguingly, for young Eorpwald's future spiritual development, Christian missionaries and converts moved through the court with increasing frequency, carrying with them stories of a new god whose power allegedly surpassed that of the traditional Germanic deities. These encounters would plant seeds of curiosity and spiritual questioning that would eventually blossom into the conversion that would define his brief reign and lead to his martyrdom. Eorpwald's early years coincided with his father's rise to dominance over much of Anglo-Saxon England, a period of unprecedented expansion and achievement that would establish the Wuffingas as one of the most powerful and influential dynasties of their age. The young prince would have witnessed the preparations for the great campaign that culminated in the Battle of the River Idle, perhaps even observing as warriors gathered from across East Anglia to follow Rædwald north to his fateful confrontation with Ethelfrith of Northumbria. The atmosphere of the court during this period would have been electric with anticipation and excitement, as the greatest military leaders of the kingdom gathered to plan strategy and prepare for battle. The young prince would have seen his father consulting with his warband, examining maps and discussing tactics, while smiths worked day and night to ensure that weapons and armor were in perfect condition for the coming conflict. The victory that established Rædwald as the most powerful king south of the Humber would have shaped Eorpwald's understanding of royal authority and the responsibilities of kingship in fundamental ways. He learned that successful rule required not only wisdom and generosity, but also the courage to take enormous risks when principle and honor demanded action, even when such risks could result in the destruction of everything his family had built over generations. Yet the price of that victory was deeply personal for the young prince and would influence his character and worldview for the rest of his life. His older brother Regnir died in the fighting at the River Idle, making Eorpwald the unexpected heir to the throne and transforming his life in ways that would have been impossible to anticipate. Suddenly, he was no longer a spare prince who could expect a comfortable life as a royal advisor or military commander, but the future king of East Anglia, with all the weight of dynastic expectation and royal responsibility falling upon his shoulders. The death of Regnir also meant that Eorpwald's education took on new urgency and intensity, as his father and advisors recognized that the kingdom's future depended on preparing him for the enormous challenges he would face as king. He needed to master not only the traditional skills of Germanic kingship, leadership in war, wisdom in council, generosity to followers, but also the complex diplomatic and administrative challenges of ruling one of Anglo-Saxon England's most important kingdoms in an age of rapid change and increasing interconnection. The lessons became more serious, the expectations higher, and the awareness of his destiny more acute as Eorpwald progressed from childhood to adolescence. He studied not only the ancient traditions of his people, but also the newer administrative practices that his father had adopted from Christian kingdoms, learning to balance respect for ancestral customs with openness to beneficial innovations that could enhance royal power and kingdom prosperity. As he matured, Eorpwald would have observed his father's remarkable balancing act between Christianity and traditional Germanic religion, a delicate performance that required extraordinary political skill and personal diplomacy. The dual altar arrangement in Rædwald's temple provided a daily reminder of the religious tensions that were reshaping the Anglo-Saxon world. while also demonstrating one possible approach to managing those tensions without abandoning either traditional legitimacy or contemporary advantages. The young prince witnessed Christian priests conducting services alongside traditional pagan ceremonies, saw his father maintain relationships with both Christian and pagan rulers, and learned to navigate the complex diplomatic and spiritual landscape of early 7th century England. This exposure to religious diversity may have made Eorpwald more receptive to Christianity than he might otherwise have been, as he had grown up seeing Christian practices as part of the normal fabric of court life rather than as foreign impositions or dangerous innovations. Unlike princes raised in purely pagan environments where Christianity would have seemed alien and threatening, Eorpwald had observed the dignity and devotion of Christian visitors to his father's court, witnessing their prayers and rituals with curiosity rather than hostility. The seeds of his later conversion may have been planted during these formative years, as he observed the behavior of committed Christians and began to consider the claims of their faith with genuine interest rather than automatic rejection. The international character of the East Anglian court also exposed Eorpwald to the broader currents of early medieval politics and culture, providing him with a sophisticated understanding of the forces that were shaping the development of European civilization. He would have met ambassadors from the Frankish kingdoms, where Christianity was already well established, and where Christian kingship had developed sophisticated theological and practical foundations that offered alternative models of royal authority and governmental organization. These encounters may have shown him that Christianity was not simply a matter of religious belief, but also a complete approach to understanding and organizing human society, one that could potentially enhance rather than diminish royal power, while providing more stable foundations for political authority than traditional Germanic reliance on military success and ancestral honor. Trade connections brought additional influences into the young prince's world, as East Anglia's position on the North Sea made it a natural center for commercial networks that linked Britain to Scandinavia, Frisia, and the Rhine Delta. Merchants carried not only goods, but also ideas, stories, and religious beliefs that gradually permeated the cultural atmosphere of the kingdom, exposing Eorpwald to alternative ways of understanding the world and its possibilities. The wealth generated by this extensive trading network also shaped Eorpwald's understanding of royal power and responsibility in important ways. He learned that successful kingship required not only military prowess, but also the ability to foster prosperity and maintain the commercial relationships that brought luxury goods and exotic materials to the royal court. The magnificent objects that surrounded him from childhood were constant reminders of the kingdom's international connections and the sophisticated diplomatic and economic networks that sustained them. As Eorpwald approached adulthood, the political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England was shifting in ways that would profoundly influence his future reign and spiritual development. Edwin's conversion to Christianity in 627 represented a crucial turning point, bringing the most powerful kingdom in northern England into the Christian fold, and creating new pressures for other rulers to follow suit or risk, increasing isolation from the emerging Christian consensus. The young prince would have observed his father's careful response to these developments, noting how Rædwald managed to maintain his independence, while acknowledging Edwin's growing influence and accommodating the religious changes that were transforming the Anglo-Saxon world. These lessons in diplomatic flexibility and strategic adaptation would prove crucial when Eorpwald inherited the throne and faced similar challenges under even more difficult circumstances. When Rædwald died around 624, Eorpwald inherited not only a kingdom at the height of its power and prosperity, but also a complex set of challenges that would test his ability to maintain his father's remarkable achievements while adapting to changing circumstances that demanded new approaches and possibly new commitments. The new king faced the difficult task of preserving East Anglia's independence and influence while navigating the increasingly Christian world of Anglo-Saxon politics, where the religious compromises that had served his father so well were becoming more difficult to maintain. The religious flexibility that had characterized Rædwald's reign was coming under increasing pressure from both Christian and pagan factions, who were demanding clearer commitments and more definitive choices from their rulers. The careful balance between old and new that had made possible the golden age of East Anglian power was becoming harder to sustain as religious differences became more polarized and political pressures intensified. The early years of Eorpwald's reign seemed to promise continuation of his father's successful policies and approaches. He maintained the kingdom's prosperity, preserved its diplomatic relationships, and showed no immediate inclination to abandon the religious flexibility that had characterized Wuffinga rule for a generation. The court continued to welcome visitors from across the known world. Trade flourished under royal protection, and the administrative innovations that had enhanced Rædwald's power were preserved and expanded. Yet beneath this apparent stability, forces were gathering that would ultimately transform the young king from pragmatic ruler to passionate convert to Christian martyr. The exposure to Christian ideas and practices that had characterized his youth was beginning to bear fruit in ways that would surprise both his supporters and his enemies. While the political pressures created by Edwin's conversion and the broader Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England were making the old compromises increasingly untenable, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic episodes in the religious history of Anglo-Saxon England, the conversion and martyrdom of a king who would discover that in the rapidly changing world of 7th century Britain, the old compromises were no longer sufficient, and that commitment to the Christian faith might require the ultimate sacrifice of life itself. The young prince, who had been raised in the sophisticated and cosmopolitan atmosphere of Rædwald's court, would soon face choices that would test not only his political wisdom, but also his spiritual courage, leading him to embrace a faith that promised eternal salvation, but demanded earthly sacrifice. The transformation of Eorpwald from pagan prince to Christian king represents one of the most pivotal moments in the religious history of Anglo-Saxon England, a conversion that would ultimately cost him his life, but helped secure Christianity's foothold in one of early medieval Europe's most important kingdoms, demonstrating both the power of the new faith and the terrible price that its early champions sometimes had to pay. The precise circumstances of Eorpwald's conversion remain somewhat mysterious, shrouded in the limited documentary sources that survive from this distant period, and complicated by the complex political and religious currents that were transforming Anglo-Saxon society during the early 7th century. What is clear is that the young king's embrace of Christianity came not as a gradual evolution or careful political calculation, but as a dramatic transformation that marked a decisive break with the religious compromises that had characterized his father's reign and would ultimately lead to his martyrdom. By 627, approximately 3 years into Eorpwald's rule, the political and religious landscape of Anglo-Saxon England had shifted dramatically in favor of Christianity, creating new pressures and opportunities for rulers who had previously been able to maintain neutrality or pursue hybrid approaches to the religious tensions of their age. Edwin of Northumbria's conversion had created a powerful alliance of Christian kingdoms stretching from Kent to the Scottish borders, while pagan rulers found themselves increasingly isolated and pressured to conform to the new religious orthodoxy that was emerging throughout much of the Anglo-Saxon world. The influence that Edwin wielded over Eorpwald was both personal and political. reflecting the complex web of obligations and relationships that connected the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during this period of rapid change and political realignment. The Northumbrian king owed his throne partly to the military support provided by Eorpwald's father during the Battle of the River Idle, creating a debt of gratitude that translated into ongoing political obligations and expectations of mutual support in times of crisis or opportunity. More importantly, Edwin had emerged as the dominant power in northern England, following his successful consolidation of control over both Bernicia and Deira, making his friendship or enmity crucial to the survival and prosperity of smaller kingdoms like East Anglia. The balance of power that had existed during Rædwald's lifetime was shifting in favour of Northumbria, creating new realities that could not be ignored by rulers who wished to maintain their independence and influence. The relationship between the two kings was further complicated by the broader dynamics of Anglo-Saxon politics during this crucial period. Edwin's conversion had been accompanied by an aggressive campaign to promote Christianity throughout his sphere of influence, using both diplomatic pressure and the promise of political rewards to encourage other rulers to follow his example and embrace the new faith that he had found so transformative. For Eorpwald, maintaining his kingdom's independence while resisting this pressure was becoming increasingly difficult, as the old strategies of religious compromise and political flexibility that had served his father so well were proving inadequate to the changed circumstances of the late 620s. The careful balance between Christianity and paganism that had characterized Rædwald's reign was coming under strain, as both sides demanded clearer commitments and more definitive choices from their supporters. The exact moment of Eorpwald's conversion is recorded differently in various sources, with some placing it in 627 and others in 632, a discrepancy that reflects not only the limited and sometimes contradictory nature of our documentary evidence, but also the complex and possibly extended process through which the young king's spiritual transformation took place. The conversion may have involved multiple stages or ceremonies, beginning with private acceptance of Christian teaching and culminating in formal baptism and public declaration of faith. This temporal uncertainty also suggests that Eorpwald's conversion may have been more complex than a simple moment of spiritual revelation or political calculation, involving instead a gradual process of intellectual and emotional transformation that unfolded over months or even years as the young king wrestled with the competing claims of old and new faiths while trying to understand their implications for his own life and the future of his kingdom. What seems certain is that Edwin played a crucial role in encouraging and facilitating Eorpwald's conversion, bringing to bear not only political pressure, but also personal persuasion and spiritual guidance that helped the young king understand the benefits and requirements of the Christian faith. The Northumbrian king had been accompanied on his own spiritual journey by Paulinus, a Roman missionary who had been part of the original Gregorian mission to Kent and possessed extensive experience in the delicate art of converting pagan rulers without alienating their traditional supporters. Paulinus brought with him not only theological learning and spiritual authority, but also practical experience in the complex political and cultural challenges involved in establishing Christianity in pagan societies. He understood that the conversion of a Germanic king required careful attention to political as well as spiritual considerations, as the new faith had to be presented in ways that enhanced rather than diminished royal authority, while traditional sources of legitimacy had to be gradually replaced rather than suddenly abandoned. Christian missionaries had learned from earlier failures and successes that the process of royal conversion was as much about statecraft as it was about theology. requiring sophisticated understanding of the cultural and political forces that shaped Germanic society and careful adaptation of Christian teaching to local customs and concerns. The most successful missionaries were those who could present Christianity not as a foreign imposition, but as the fulfillment of ancient hopes and the solution to persistent problems that traditional religions had been unable to address adequately. For Eorpwald, the appeal of Christianity may have been both spiritual and practical, addressing not only his personal quest for meaning and purpose, but also the political and administrative challenges that faced any ruler in the rapidly changing world of 7th century England. The new faith offered a more powerful divine patron than the traditional Germanic gods, one whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of any single kingdom, and whose authority was recognized by the most sophisticated and successful rulers of the age. Christian rulers could claim divine appointment and universal authority in ways that purely Germanic kingship could not match, drawing on theological concepts and institutional structures that had been developed over centuries of Christian thought and practice. The promise of eternal salvation also provided an answer to the warrior's ultimate fear, that death might come before sufficient honor had been achieved to ensure remembrance among one's people and a place in the halls of the gods. The theological content of Eorpwald's conversion would have been carefully tailored to address the concerns and interests of a Germanic warrior king who had been raised in the traditions of his ancestors, but was now facing the challenge of ruling in a world where those traditions were being challenged and transformed by new ideas and influences. Christian missionaries had become skilled at presenting their faith in terms that resonated with traditional Anglo-Saxon values, while gradually introducing more challenging concepts that would reshape understanding of divine authority, human destiny, and royal responsibility. The idea of Christ as a divine war leader who had triumphed over death itself could appeal to kings who understood power primarily in military terms and who sought divine allies in their constant struggle against human enemies and supernatural forces. The concept of the church as a spiritual army engaged in cosmic warfare against the forces of evil could resonate with warriors who had been trained to value courage, loyalty, and sacrifice in the service of worthy causes. Yet Christianity also offered more subtle appeals that addressed the intellectual and emotional needs of rulers who were grappling with the complex challenges of governing increasingly sophisticated societies. The faith's emphasis on justice, mercy, and divine law provided frameworks for understanding and addressing legal and political problems that traditional Germanic customs were not always equipped to handle effectively, while its promise of universal brotherhood offered possibilities for expanding royal authority beyond traditional tribal and kinship boundaries. The ceremonial aspects of Eorpwald's baptism were undoubtedly designed to impress both the king himself and his followers, demonstrating the power and sophistication of the new faith while providing opportunities for political theatre that enhanced royal prestige and divine legitimacy. Christian conversion ceremonies in this period typically involved elaborate rituals that combined spiritual symbolism with practical politics, creating spectacles that were both religiously meaningful and politically effective. The presence of Edwin as sponsor would have added enormous diplomatic significance to the religious ceremony, publicly demonstrating the alliance between the two kingdoms, while symbolically representing Eorpwald's integration into the broader community of Christian rulers. The baptism would have been conducted according to Roman liturgical traditions that emphasized the universal character of the Christian Church, while also adapting to local customs and expectations in ways that made the ceremony comprehensible and meaningful to Anglo-Saxon audiences. The choice of location for the baptism would also have carried important symbolic and practical significance. If the ceremony took place in Northumbria, as seems likely given the lack of proper facilities in East Anglia at this time, It would have demonstrated Eorpwald's willingness to travel to Edwin's territory and accept his spiritual guidance, while also providing an opportunity for the two kings to discuss the political implications of the conversion and coordinate their future policies. The participation of other nobles and officials in the ceremony would have helped to establish the legitimacy of the conversion, while also creating a network of supporters who could help defend and promote the new faith within East Anglian society. These early converts would have formed the nucleus of a Christian faction within the kingdom that could provide political support for religious innovation, while also serving as intermediaries between the king and his more traditional subjects. Yet even as Eorpwald embraced Christianity with apparent enthusiasm and sincerity, the conversion created immediate challenges for his rule that would ultimately prove fatal to both the king and his religious policies. The new faith's exclusive claims that Christ was the only true God and that salvation came only through him directly contradicted the religious foundations of Germanic kingship and the spiritual traditions that had legitimized Wuffinga rule for generations. The traditional gods, who had been honored by Eorpwald's ancestors, were now being rejected as false idols or demonic deceptions, potentially undermining the entire basis of royal authority and dynastic legitimacy. The king's subjects, advisors, and warriors faced their own dilemmas in responding to his conversion, as loyalty to the king was a fundamental principle of Germanic society that had traditionally been understood in religious as well as political terms. Could warriors sworn to follow a king descended from Woden continue to serve a ruler who now worshipped Christ and rejected the gods of his fathers? Could pagan priests and wise men maintain their positions in a Christian court? Or would their traditional roles and influence be transferred to foreign missionaries and unfamiliar clerics? These questions had no easy answers and created tensions that would ultimately prove impossible to resolve through compromise or gradual adaptation. Eorpwald's response to these challenges seems to have been wholehearted commitment to his new faith, rather than the cautious compromise that had served his father so well during his reign. Unlike Rædwald, who had maintained dual altars and tried to balance Christian and pagan elements in his religious practice, Eorpwald appears to have embraced Christianity completely and begun actively promoting it throughout his kingdom, seeking to transform East Anglia into a genuinely Christian society rather than maintaining the religious flexibility that had characterized the previous generation. This decisive approach may have reflected the young king's personal temperament and spiritual convictions, but it also responded to the changed political circumstances of the late 620s, when the religious compromises that had been possible in Rædwald's time were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Christianity was gaining strength and confidence throughout Anglo-Saxon England, while pagan resistance was becoming more organized and determined, creating a polarized environment where fence-sitting was no longer a viable option for rulers who wanted to maintain their kingdom's independence and influence. The conversion also brought immediate benefits that may have seemed to justify the risks involved in abandoning traditional religious practices and alienating conservative supporters. Christian kingdoms tended to support each other diplomatically and militarily, offering Eorpwald potential allies against any enemies who might threaten East Anglia's security or independence. The new faith also brought access to sophisticated administrative practices and literate clergy who could help modernize the kingdom's government and expand its international connections. More subtly, Christianity offered Eorpwald a different model of kingship that might actually strengthen royal authority in the long term, while providing more stable foundations for political power than the traditional Germanic emphasis on military success and ancestral honor. Christian rulers claimed divine appointment that did not depend solely on battlefield victories or the favor of warrior gods, potentially providing more reliable legitimacy that could survive temporary setbacks or military defeats. The universal character of the Christian God also offered theoretical justification for expanding royal authority beyond traditional tribal and kinship boundaries, creating possibilities for building larger and more stable political entities than had been possible under purely Germanic systems of government. These long-term advantages would have appealed to an intelligent and ambitious young king who sought to build upon his father's achievements while adapting to the changing realities of early medieval politics. Yet even as Eorpwald embraced these new possibilities and committed himself to the transformation of his kingdom, forces were gathering that would ultimately destroy him and temporarily reverse the Christianization of East Anglia. His conversion had created a fundamental split within East Anglian society between those who welcomed the new faith and those who saw it as a betrayal of ancient traditions and ancestral gods, while his apparent enthusiasm for Christianity alarmed many of his traditional supporters and provided his political enemies with opportunities to exploit religious divisions for their own purposes. The stage was set for tragedy as competing visions of divine authority and royal legitimacy came into irreconcilable conflict. Eorpwald had committed himself and his kingdom to a religious transformation that promised great rewards but demanded enormous risks, demonstrating admirable spiritual courage while also making himself vulnerable to those who saw his conversion as weakness rather than strength. The young king who had sought to lead his people into a new spiritual age would soon discover that the price of such leadership could be death itself, and that the triumph of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England would require sacrifices that few rulers were prepared to make. The brief period following Eorpwald's conversion thus represents a crucial moment in the history of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England, when the success or failure of his attempt to transform East Anglia into a Christian kingdom would have profound implications for the future of the faith throughout Britain. Unfortunately for the young king, and for the immediate prospects of Christianity in East Anglia, powerful forces were already moving against him, forces that would soon transform his spiritual triumph into personal tragedy and temporary defeat for the Christian cause in one of Anglo-Saxon England's most important kingdoms. The death of King Eorpwald in 627 or 628 marked one of the most tragic episodes in the early history of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England, a martyrdom that would transform a young king from historical figure into saint, while plunging East Anglia into religious chaos and political upheaval that would reverberate through the kingdom for years to come, and provide a sobering lesson about the dangers faced by rulers who chose to champion the Christian faith in a still largely pagan world. The exact circumstances of Eorpwald's assassination remain partially obscured by the limited documentary sources that survive from this distant period, yet the broad outlines of the tragedy are clear enough to reveal both the human drama of individual betrayal and the larger forces of religious and political conflict that made such violence almost inevitable in the volatile world of early 7th century England. Soon after his conversion to Christianity, perhaps only months after his baptism and public declaration of faith, the young king was murdered by Rædwald, a pagan nobleman whose motives combined religious fanaticism with political opportunism in ways that reflected the deep divisions tearing through Anglo-Saxon society as traditional beliefs and practices came into conflict with the revolutionary claims of the new faith. The name Rædwald itself provides important clues about the assassin's identity, background, and motivations that help us understand both the immediate circumstances of the murder and the broader context of religious and political tensions that made such violence possible. The element Rick in Anglo-Saxon names typically indicated noble status and often suggested connection to royal or aristocratic families, while the suffix -bert was particularly common among the East Anglian elite and may have indicated Frankish or Kentish influence within the kingdom's ruling circles. This was not the desperate act of a random fanatic or foreign enemy, but the calculated move of someone with both the access necessary to approach the king and the political connections required to challenge royal authority successfully. Rædwald belonged to the East Anglian establishment, possibly even to a cadet branch of the royal family itself, and his ability to assassinate the king and seize power suggests that he had substantial support among traditional elements within the kingdom who opposed Eorpwald's religious innovations. The religious dimension of the murder cannot be separated from its political context, as Eorpwald's conversion had created a crisis of legitimacy within East Anglian society that went far beyond mere theological disagreement to touch the very foundations of royal authority and social organization. For centuries, the Wuffinga dynasty had justified its rule through claims of descent from Woden and the favor of the traditional Germanic gods who governed warfare, kingship, and the natural order. The king's rejection of these deities in favor of Christ represented not just personal apostasy, but a fundamental challenge to the religious foundations of royal authority and the spiritual traditions that had legitimized the dynasty's power for generations. From the perspective of traditional Anglo-Saxon culture, Eorpwald's conversion could be interpreted as a betrayal of his ancestors, his people, and the gods who had blessed his dynasty with power and prosperity since the first Wuffinga kings had established their rule in the mists of the 6th century. The young king had broken faith with the spiritual traditions that had legitimized Wuffinga rule for generations, potentially forfeiting the divine protection that enabled successful kingship and inviting the anger of supernatural forces that could bring disaster upon the entire kingdom. In the eyes of religious conservatives like Rædwald, such apostasy demanded punishment not only for the king's personal salvation, but for the spiritual welfare of the entire kingdom and the preservation of the cosmic order that connected human society to divine authority. The political implications of the conversion were equally troubling for those who opposed it and saw in Eorpwald's embrace of Christianity a dangerous departure from the policies that had made East Anglia prosperous and independent under his father's rule. The new faith aligned the kingdom more closely with Edwin of Northumbria and other Christian rulers, potentially compromising East Anglia's independence and traditional alliances while subordinating the kingdom's interest to those of foreign powers whose primary loyalty was to a universal church rather than to the particular needs and traditions of the Anglo-Saxon peoples. Christianity brought with it foreign influences and practices that threatened to undermine indigenous customs and institutions that had evolved over centuries of experience and adaptation to local conditions. For nobles who had prospered under the old system and whose power depended on traditional relationships and practices, the new faith represented not enlightenment, but dangerous innovation that could destroy everything they held dear and reduce them to subordinate positions within an alien religious and political order. The timing of the assassination suggests careful planning and political calculation, rather than spontaneous violence born of sudden rage or religious fervor. Rædwald appears to have waited until Eorpwald's conversion was publicly known and had begun to have practical effects on the kingdom's policies and relationships, but before the king could consolidate his position or establish effective defenses against opposition from traditional elements within East Anglian society. This narrow window of opportunity reflects both the assassin's political sophistication and understanding of the dynamics of royal power, as well as the speed with which events were unfolding in the aftermath of the royal conversion. The king's enemies recognized that they had only a brief period in which to act before Christian influences became too entrenched to be easily removed, while Eorpwald's supporters had not yet had time to organize effective protection for their newly converted ruler. The method of the murder itself remains unclear from the surviving sources, though they suggest it was accomplished through treachery rather than open combat or formal challenge to royal authority. This approach would have been consistent with Ricbert's apparent political calculations, as a direct military challenge to royal authority would have been risky and uncertain, requiring the assembly of substantial forces and the acceptance of significant casualties even if successful. Assassination offered the possibility of removing Eorpwald quickly and decisively before his supporters could organize effective resistance, while also avoiding the destruction and instability that would have resulted from civil war or extended military conflict. The choice of treachery over open warfare also reflected the complex personal relationships that existed within the East Anglian elite, where family connections and ancient loyalties made direct confrontation particularly difficult and politically dangerous. The immediate aftermath of the murder reveals the depth of the divisions that Eorpwald's conversion had created within East Anglian society, and the extent to which traditional elements had been alienated by the king's embrace of Christianity. Rather than provoking outrage and demands for vengeance against the assassin, Eorpwald's death appears to have been welcomed by a significant portion of the population, including many members of the traditional elite who saw it as a necessary correction to dangerous religious and political innovations. Ricbert was able to seize power and maintain control for approximately 3 years, a remarkable achievement that suggests his actions had substantial popular support, and that opposition to Eorpwald's Christian policies was both widespread and deeply rooted within East Anglian society. The ease with which the assassin established his authority indicates that the murdered king had been more isolated than his supporters had realized, and that traditional religious loyalties remained stronger than Christian innovations among the general population. This pagan resurgence that followed Eorpwald's death was not merely a political reaction against an unpopular ruler, but a genuine religious revival that sought to restore the traditional gods and customs that the Christian king had attempted to supplant. Temples that had been closed or converted during Eorpwald's brief reign were reopened with great ceremony. Pagan priests who had been marginalized were restored to positions of influence and honor, and the old festivals and ceremonies that had been suppressed or modified were celebrated with renewed enthusiasm and public participation. The restoration of traditional religious practices was accompanied by systematic efforts to erase the memory of Eorpwald's Christian innovations and to purge the kingdom of foreign influences that were seen as corrupting and dangerous. Christian symbols and artifacts were removed from public spaces. Foreign missionaries were expelled or forced to flee, and the administrative and legal changes that had been introduced during the brief period of Christian rule were reversed in favor of traditional customs and practices. The ease with which Christianity was swept away in the aftermath of Eorpwald's murder reveals the superficial nature of the kingdom's conversion and the limited impact that the new faith had made during the young king's brief reign. Unlike the gradual organic transformations that had occurred in some other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, where Christianity had been introduced carefully and allowed to take root slowly among the general population, the Christianization of East Anglia had been largely a top-down process driven by royal authority rather than popular conviction. When that authority was removed through Eorpwald's assassination, the new faith proved to have shallow roots among the general population and insufficient institutional support to survive without royal patronage and protection. The Christian clergy, who had been introduced during the king's reign, lacked the local connections and popular support necessary to maintain their position in the face of organized opposition, while the administrative and legal innovations associated with Christianity had not had time to demonstrate their practical benefits or win acceptance from traditional elites. Yet even as paganism celebrated its temporary triumph and traditional practices were restored with great fanfare, the seeds of Christianity's eventual victory were already being planted in the fertile soil of martyrdom and sacrifice. Eorpwald's death, while representing an immediate defeat for the Christian cause, also provided the new faith with a powerful symbol of courage and commitment that would inspire future generations of converts and demonstrate that Christianity was worth dying for. A message that would prove remarkably effective in an honor-oriented society that valued courageous death above comfortable life. The young king, who had died for his beliefs, became a martyr whose example demonstrated the complete sincerity of his conversion and the transformative power of the Christian faith. His willingness to face death rather than abandon his religious convictions provided compelling testimony to the truth and importance of Christianity, while also establishing a standard of spiritual courage that would inspire others to embrace the faith despite the risks and sacrifices involved. The theological significance of Eorpwald's martyrdom would be developed by later Christian writers who saw in his death a perfect example of the conflict between worldly wisdom and divine truth that defined the Christian life. The young king had chosen God over country, eternal salvation over temporal power, and spiritual integrity over political compromise, demonstrating through his sacrifice the ultimate priorities that should guide all Christian believers. The broader political implications of Eorpwald's assassination extended far beyond East Anglia itself to influence the development of Christianity throughout Anglo-Saxon England. Edwin of Northumbria, who had sponsored the young king's conversion and served as his baptismal sponsor, faced the embarrassing reality that his protege had been murdered by his own subjects within months of embracing Christianity, a failure that undermined Edwin's own authority and demonstrated the limits of his ability to protect Christian allies or promote the new faith through political pressure alone. The murder also sent a clear and chilling message to other Anglo-Saxon rulers who might be contemplating conversion or who had already embraced Christianity but faced opposition from traditional elements within their kingdoms. The new faith might offer spiritual benefits and political advantages, but it also carried serious risks that could prove fatal to unprepared or isolated kings who lacked sufficient support to defend their religious innovations against determined opposition. For the Christian Church, Eorpwald's martyrdom represented both tragedy and opportunity, involving immediate loss but also long-term gain that would prove crucial to the faith's eventual triumph in Anglo-Saxon England. The immediate loss of a royal patron was devastating, particularly in a kingdom as important and influential as East Anglia, where royal support was essential for missionary activity and the establishment of Christian institutions. Yet the manner of the king's death provided powerful testimony to the transformative power of the Christian faith and the ultimate worthlessness of earthly kingdoms compared to the eternal rewards promised by Christ to those who remained faithful unto death. The young king's martyrdom became a powerful tool for Christian evangelization, demonstrating that the new faith could produce heroes and saints who were worthy of admiration and emulation according to the highest standards of Germanic culture. The location and circumstances of Eorpwald's burial became matters of considerable speculation and religious significance in the years and centuries that followed his death. Some later traditions suggested that he might have been interred in one of the ship burials at Sutton Hoo, though this remains a matter of scholarly debate and may reflect later attempts to connect the martyr king with the magnificent archaeological remains that testify to the wealth and power of his dynasty. More important than the precise location of his remains was the growing belief among Christians that his death had sanctified both the king himself and the cause for which he had died, transforming a political failure into a spiritual victory that would inspire future generations of believers. The cult of Saint Eorpwald that gradually developed in the centuries following his death reflected the Church's success in transforming martyrdom into triumph and death into eternal life. The immediate practical consequences of Eorpwald's assassination were severe and long-lasting, involving not only the temporary triumph of paganism in East Anglia, but also the disruption of the broader Christian alliance that Edwin had been attempting to create throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The murder demonstrated that Christian conversion was not irreversible, and that traditional religious loyalties could be mobilized effectively against royal innovations when those innovations lacked sufficient popular support or institutional foundation. The 3 years of pagan rule that followed Eorpwald's death would provide sobering lessons about the challenges faced by Christianity in establishing itself permanently within Germanic societies that had deep and ancient connections to traditional religious practices. The ease with which Christian innovations were reversed and traditional customs restored suggested that the new faith would need to develop more sophisticated approaches to conversion that addressed popular concerns and cultural sensitivities rather than relying solely on royal patronage and political pressure. Yet the ultimate significance of Eorpwald's martyrdom lay not in its immediate political consequences, but in its long-term spiritual impact on the development of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England. The young king, who had lived for only a few years after his conversion, became in death an eternal symbol of Christian courage and commitment, demonstrating that some truths were worth dying for, and that the ultimate victory belonged not to those who killed the body, but to those who remained faithful to the soul's salvation. His story would be remembered and retold for generations as evidence of Christianity's power to transform human hearts and inspire heroic sacrifice, while his example would provide comfort and encouragement to other believers who face persecution or pressure to abandon their faith. The martyrdom that had seemed to represent Christianity's defeat in East Anglia would ultimately become one of the foundation stones of the faith's eventual triumph throughout Anglo-Saxon England, proving that God could bring victory from apparent defeat and eternal life from temporal death. As our peaceful journey through the life and martyrdom of St. Eorpwald draws to a gentle close, let us rest in the quiet wisdom of his extraordinary story, a tale that reminds us of the transformative power of faith and the eternal significance of courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Tonight, we have walked alongside a young king who inherited one of the most powerful kingdoms in Anglo-Saxon England, only to discover that earthly crowns and worldly authority pale in comparison to the eternal truths of divine love and salvation. Eorpwald's brief reign, spanning just a few short years in the early 7th century, became a beacon of light that continues to shine across the centuries, illuminating the path for all who seek to live lives of authentic faith and courageous commitment. In the misty landscapes of ancient East Anglia, where pagan gods once held sway and Christian missionaries first planted the seeds of a new understanding, we have witnessed the profound struggle between old traditions and new revelations. Eorpwald's story speaks to the timeless human challenge of embracing transformation, even when that transformation demands the ultimate sacrifice. As you drift into peaceful slumber, carry with you the memory of this remarkable king who chose divine truth over earthly comfort, eternal salvation over temporal power, and spiritual integrity over political compromise. His martyrdom reminds us that some convictions are worth dying for, and that apparent defeats can become the foundation for ultimate victory. Thank you for joining us on this gentle journey through history. If you found comfort in Eorpwald's story, please consider sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We cherish hearing from our community of fellow travelers and history lovers. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more peaceful tales from the past. Until we meet again in the quiet halls of history, May your dreams be filled with the courage of saints and the peace of knowing that truth ultimately triumphs over all opposition. Sleep well, dear listener, and may the memory of St. Eorpwald's faithful witness bring you comfort and inspiration in your own journey of faith and discovery. Sweet dreams, and welcome to the eternal fellowship of those who have found in history's gentle whispers the timeless truths that guide us through the darkness toward the light of divine love and eternal peace.